Hello, everybody. My name is Angus Blair. I'm the CIB Visiting Professor of Practice at the School of Business in AUC. This seminar is being organized. It's a regular program by the Burckart Center at AUC. The outline of today's seminar and webinar is, it's time for a new way to think about investing, one that contend with the complex challenges which we face in the 21st century. In the new paradigm shifting book, 21st Century Investing, Redirecting Financial Strategies to Drive Systems Change, co-authors William Burket and Steve Lydenberg show how system-level investors support and enhance the health and stability of the social, financial, and environmental systems on which they depend for long-term returns. They preserve and strengthen these fundamental systems while still generating competitive or otherwise acceptable performance. During this session, Mr. Burket will build off his book, build upon it, to show investors and their advisors the what, the why, and the how of system-level investment. What it means to manage system-level risks and rewards, why it is imperative to do so now, and how to integrate this new way of thinking into their current practice. With regard to the speaker, Mr. William Burket, he's the president of the Investment Integration Project, TIIP, a consulting services and applied research firm that provides advice, thought leadership, and a turnkey solution to help investors manage systemic risks and opportunities. Mr. Burket has advised a range of clients, including investment management firms, private foundations, and endowments, government and major industry bodies, working with all of them to integrate impact and investment goals through the development and implementation of related strategies. He has also contributed to the field through groundbreaking research, including the development of market insights and practical guidance for investors and financial advisors in collaboration with the Money Management Institute, co-editing The New Frontiers of Philanthropy, a guide to the new tools and actors that are reshaping global philanthropy, and Social Investing, published through the Oxford University Press, and helping to write The Status of Social Impact Investing Market, a primer for the UK Cabinet Office. Very happy to hear that. That was distributed to the policymakers at the inaugural G8 level Forum for Impact Investing. His writing has been featured in Barron's, Pensions and Investments, The Guardian, Forbes, Quartz, Top 100, 1,000 Funds, Investment in Pensions Europe, and a number of others. Quite significant and very great to see. The Chronicle of Philanthropy, Fund Fire, and The Next Billion, to name a few, were also written by him. Mr. Burket is a fellow at the High Meadows Institute and co-author of the book we just mentioned, which I've read this week, I have to say, and very much enjoyed. 21st Century Investing, Redirecting Financial Strategies to Drive Systems Change. So welcome, Bill, to this webinar. I'm glad your Wi-Fi to a degree is working.
I am too.
So welcome to this discussion, albeit we're based in Egypt and you're in America. It would be super if you could give us an oversight and overview in terms of what you're trying to do with your book and your overall work at large.
Yeah, no, thank you for the intro, and hopefully I sound and look okay. I'm doing this all on my cell phone, so we're just gonna ride this wave as long as we can. So yeah, I appreciate the introduction and really thrilled to be here. So I think, you know, in terms of giving an overview of the book and really what we've been focused on at TIIP, it might be helpful to kind of start with the basic question that we essentially start the book with. And really it's, what are the biggest threats to an investor's portfolio these days? And, you know, climate change, it impacts all investors across all asset classes. Something like income inequality, easy for me to say, threatens to polarize politics. It paralyzes governments, it destabilizes democracies, leads to trade wars, geopolitical conflicts, so on and so forth. And then you have something more recent like the pandemic, which disrupts economic models and requires these like heroic efforts by government and private enterprise to essentially keep system-wide collapse at bay. And so really, these are these 21st century, hence where we got the title, 21st century's fundamentally new and different, destabilizing social and environmental challenges. They're global, they have tipping points that once passed cannot be reversed. And these are these essentially systemic risks in a highly interconnected and complex world that is only growing more so. And altogether, they threaten long-term investment returns across all asset classes in ways that essentially that traditional risk management can't cope with. And so all of this leads to this big $200 trillion question. How are investors supposed to act on these systemic risks? And what we did with the book was to essentially try to lay out an answer to that. And this book, it essentially gives that roadmap for how investors can essentially shift their investment practices to meet the challenges of our modern times. And it's based on this work that Steve Lydenberg, who's my co-founder and co-writer, so Steve had this idea that we needed to push the industry to really grapple with systemic change. And so that's why he founded TIIP. And then I came on to help lead it. And over 6 years, we've been essentially doing a lot of that big work to kind of identify the principles and concepts around what we're dubbing system level investment, and to really lay out a lot of the baseline evidence for who's doing what and how that's different from conventional investing or sustainable investing. And really the big idea at the center of the book and our work generally is that investors essentially need to better understand and act on these big picture context of their investments, and that these feedback loops between their investments and the planet's overarching systems that make profitable investment opportunities possible, that's the real challenge, or that's the real opportunity. And so we've described this as system level investing. So like I said, the book really goes into the what, why, and how of system level investment. So it goes into what it means to manage system level risks and rewards, why it is imperative to do so now, and how to integrate this new way of thinking into current practice. And if you just read the book over the weekend, you'll understand that there are essentially these 6 key elements of that process that are the same for all investors. They set goals, they decide where to focus, they allocate assets, apply investment tools, leverage advanced techniques, and evaluate results. And so for each step along the way, we illustrate the need for and benefits of incorporating a system level perspective. Now, if it works for you, I think I would maybe just jump into kind of an issue and kind of illustrate what does that distinction look like in practice as you're thinking about applying the system level lens to a particular systemic issue. Would that be helpful?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so let's take an issue like income inequality. This has been a real big focus of TIIP's work. And it's one of those issues that's proven to be, I think, a bit more challenging, as you know, for the investment community largely, but also the kind of ESG community generally, to really get their hands around. And so if you think about it kind of in a narrow sense, conventional investors will often kind of profit from actual certain levels of income inequality. It's why we see this kind of divide between what's happening in capital markets and what's happening in the real economy, particularly in the aftermath or in the midst of and hopefully soon aftermath of the pandemic. And so conventional investors, they actually profit from this. The motivation to change is not there. Now, sustainable investors, they may try to make this portfolio a little bit more socially responsible, try to boost minimum wage for a particular company, things like that. And then kind of declare victory, because yet again, the portfolio level lens is kind of where they start and stop. Now, system level investors go a bit further. So they're asking not only how can they manage the risks posed by this systemic issue for this or that portfolio, but what initiatives they can actually take that will create fundamental change in the system itself that has generated growing income inequality to begin with. So they look for leverage points within the current system that will drive change. This means advocating for setting of a minimum wage, not just by one firm, but in a locality, a state, or a nation. And then the same can be said for other key leverage points, such as diversity, unions and workers' rights, taxes, and safety. They want to see to it that industry standards are set, voluntary if necessary, regulatory if possible, and demand that government enforce the laws and regulations already on the books. When they recognize that to make system level change happen, one voice alone is not enough, system level investors join with their peers to amplify their message on the importance of addressing income inequality and increase their influence. And so those that are making progress in this way adopt tactics such as investing in portfolios entirely targeted or heavily weighted towards social and environmental solutions, and advocate for public policies that reduce systemic risks and advance the health and resilience of crucial systems. So they engage at industry levels to set standards and norms, they collaborate with others to amplify their influence, and they set clear goals for system level, not just portfolio related progress, and report on how they are working to achieve those goals. And so with these examples, it essentially shows that it's time for this big leap into the future with a new era of investing, right? And as we go into the book, doing so is not only what investment should be, but what it must be if the financial community is going to do its part to avoid this kind of multiplicity of collapses and crises that will threaten our complex world in the coming decades. And they need to do it because it will help them to take advantage of the opportunities that addressing these challenges head on at a fundamental level can generate not only for themselves, but for all investors. And I think one of the things, I guess, and then I think we can, I can dispense with the preamble, but I think one of the things that I want to reinforce too is that the investment community is definitely starting to catch on to the importance of this idea. And we see that more and more with acknowledgement and alignment with the, sustainable development goals from the United Nations and other sorts of global frameworks that investors are vaguely aligning with, but are more and more trying to understand their contributions towards. And I think part of this, it just speaks to this urgency that more investors are understanding in terms of needing to address these big systemic issues. And this is definitely increasingly reflected in heightened concern by investors for responsibility for the stewardship of their assets. One that policymakers and those concerned with corporate governance, one of the things that we were talking about before we got on the phone or on the Zoom, they're essentially gradually integrating this language of systemic risk into. So for example, let's go back to the UK. So the UK Stewardship Code of 2020, Principle 4 directs asset owners and managers to identify and respond to market-wide and systemic risks to promote a well-functioning financial system. That's huge. And other countries are starting to consider similar stewardship guides. And then you take something like the CFA Institute, the big global association for investment professionals, and they've also echoed this sentiment. And in a recent report, and this was back in December of last year, essentially they talked about the future of sustainability and investment management. And in it, they acknowledge that multiple interconnected factors that drive the investment ecosystem. And CFA advised readers to move beyond traditional ESG practices and into system level thinking. So when you have something like that happen, where all of a sudden the major kind of credentialing arm of the investment community is now calling for this, that's big. And it's like fluoride in the water. You can't wash it out. So anyway, so this is all a long way to say that Steve and I, we started this journey 6 years ago. A lot, wasn't a very crowded intersection, and more as the years progressed, more and more investors, associations, standard setters, the community generally has really attempted to kind of get their hands around this and figure out ways to act on it. So hopefully that provides a fairly good concrete start for us.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Now, let's look at this again. Over the last year and a half, since the beginning of this crisis, you will know, as I picked up, the debate around ESG, the move of capital into green funds, ESG funds, and so on, was enormous last year. And then in the last few months, there's been quite a bit of critique, given the general issue. It's a kind of generic term, and you have ministers across the world using many of the phrases, as you mentioned, from the UN Sustainability report and the UN Principles for Responsible Investment and others and so on. And now we've had, in the last few weeks, the SEC investigating Deutsche Bank's asset management, or DWS, for technically greenwashing. That is basically issuing funds that are meant to be ESG and aren't. No. If we look at this trend, and it's been very significant given my background in investment banking and asset management, and it's totally transformed in the last 20 years. And it's picked up speed. But would you agree with me that there is a problem in the overall market in that we don't have standards, common standards? there's a thrust of movement of concern where many institutions and government bodies and international bodies are following along the same lines, but there isn't a code that everyone agrees on that really is then integrated into their products and efforts within their institutions. And if that is the case, how can we do that? How can we make these institutions work more efficiently to take forward these goals?
Yeah, so I think you're definitely pinpointing a major tension point in the industry, not just for system level investors, but also for sustainable and impact investors. And I think part of the problem or challenge here is that this is a weird case of the fact that practice has led theory largely across the gestation of all of this. And so you have policy essentially trying to catch up to create the enabling environment that limits abuse, but also encourages action. And so I think some of the strides that have been taken recently, whether it was SEC here in the US, I mean, something as simple as, I remember, this a couple months ago, they put out new guidance basically saying that any advisor that essentially offers ESG products to clients or claims ESG products essentially has to show their work now in a way that they never had to before. They really have to prove that what they're offering. Now, it's not for all investments, it's just for the ones that they claim as ESG. Now, contrast that with what's happening in Europe, where the regulation that's come through is basically saying all investments now have to account for the ESG dimensions of the investments, regardless of whether they're being held out as ESG. And so I think what you're starting to see is this kind of better acknowledgement or greater acknowledgement by policymakers and a real intention to try to get their hands around this, because we have reached a point where we've moved from this kind of period of, if you think about the gestation of industries, this period of kind of uncoordinated innovation into actually building a marketplace for what we're all doing and talking about. And so I think with that shift, that's why you're seeing all of a sudden policy catching up. And I think it's really important, and it gets into these different tension points around greenwashing, around impact washing generally in the industry. And I think the inclination oftentimes when this debate comes up is to basically say, well, private sector shouldn't even be doing this, and so the government should be doing it, or this is really, the UN saying, hey, private sector has to come in, and we're not going to meet these goals unless more investors are, putting more capital in this direction. I think at the end of the day, it's not an either or, it's a both. It's a yes and yes. And I think that's been part of the dilemma, is that there hasn't been as much informing and vice versa of investors of policy or policies of investors. And until we start to, I think, solve for that better, it's going to be this kind of continuing tension. I will say, though, that the Biden administration, at least here in the US, has been by leaps and bounds way more acknowledging of the importance of sustainable investing as like our kind of big term or banner that is being regulated now, but also the interest in promoting it as a real mechanism for addressing social and environmental challenges. That's such a night and day contrast to the previous administration, and I think that's what's all of a sudden really driving a lot of change here in the US. And I think you can point to that in certain settings, in certain other jurisdictions, on where all of a sudden policy is finally meeting the moment in a way that, I think investors needed it to.
So if you look at what's happening, again, there are a number of factors. I find that there are a number of pincer movements around all of this. Obviously, society is changing and continues to change, especially amongst the young. Corporates are waking up to change. But I'm of the view, yes, you're quite right. I think that we have to bring in the private sector and they've got to buy into this. But so far, there aren't that many that are really doing it. But I think you need leaders to lead the way. I think CalPERS, where you are right now, CalPERS, I think I very much admire. I don't know if you do. The way in which they're leading by being engaged with their companies, with the companies within which they invest, to transform, unlike other institutions that decide to just sell carbon-heavy industries, for example. But it's quite interesting, earlier this year, the chief investment officer of BlackRock, one of the world's biggest institutional investors, for those who are not familiar with the name, where he had said that they were worried, increasingly worried, about their carbon-heavy investments in a few years' time, at the end of which they review their investments, being basically stranded assets. So I wonder, in terms of the speed, are corporates really and institutional investors making enough speed to make these changes?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we need to take these as wins where we can see them. And I think, part of what TIIP has been doing is really documenting a range of investors, not just the big long-term institutional ones, but also all the way down to kind of smaller, $50 million private equity firms. And really trying to understand what is the real opportunity here. And is it exclusive to long-term investors, big institutionals like GPIF or CalSTRS and so on and so forth, or can others engage in it? And I think the important thing to bear in mind is that what CalPERS is doing and what a number of the other investors that we see that are moving in this direction they're doing, they're not just stopping at engagement, right? Like they're looking at what are those kind of conventional investment activities that they engage in? What are their investment belief statements? How do they approach portfolio construction and security selection? How do they begin to think about how this starts to shift manager selection and even corporate engagement? And so there's these kind of like conventional things that they're already doing that any number of these different, what we refer to as system investors, they're beginning to integrate this focus into those activities. But then they're also going well above and beyond it. And they're starting to consider the kind of broader toolkit that's going to be needed. So it's not just, things like that where you're thinking about, okay, allocation of assets, what are we doing and what are the ways that may get shaped, or some of our policies and programs, how do we begin to alter those or enhance those to kind of take this focus? They're also starting to think about things like, how do we start to drive more influence to ultimately then drive collective action by the investment community? So they're building up shared knowledge bases. They are doing things like filling in the data gaps that make a lot of this decision useful. And they are working actively with policymakers to kind of set standards and whatnot. So I think, are they catching up fast enough? No, I mean, at the end of the day, we're off track to meet the SDGs. And I think, and even there, we're not in those SDGs, we're not quite capturing the kind of interconnected and complex angles. I mean, part of the problem with the SDGs is that they really view these issues as complicated. If we do this, then this will happen. And in reality, if we do this in a complex system, if we do this, certain things could happen, but then other things could be happening that are going to change that. And so without looking at that kind of interconnected quality between all these issues, I think that's where, and fully acknowledging that we have to go beyond just basic corporate engagement or basic portfolio construction to really start to get to addressing a lot of the inherently constantly changing dynamics of these systems. I think that's the bigger challenge. It's not to say that investors aren't aware of this now and that they're not necessarily acting fast enough. I think they're going to be constrained by incentives. They're going to be constrained by the availability of data. They're going to be constrained by just cultural barriers that they have to still overcome, and regulatory uncertainty in some cases. But I think that they're moving in this direction. It's just part of the dilemma is that once they move in this direction, are we making sure that they are starting to get to that kind of level of understanding about the nuances of systemic change? And that's honestly for us, it's in 6 years' time, we've had so many conversations with people like, yeah, we're interested, but it's really getting into, okay, are all of these other things, like how do you do it? And how do you do it in a way that, because so many of these folks, their realities are based on short-term metrics. How do you start to get them to shift to a more long-term perspective? And we're not talking about like long-term as in 3 years or 5 years. It's like these things, GPIF refers to itself as a long-term investor, but a super long-term investor, because its time horizon to pay out beneficiaries is over 100 years. So when you start to grapple with that reality, that's why I think a lot of this has stayed so much in the big institutional pension fund world. But what we are starting to see is that more and more, whether it's in family offices or foundations or more impact investment type managers, we're starting to see more of that uptake. So yeah, I mean, and I think it also, not to complicate it more, but like, I think it also depends on the issue, and each issue kind of has a different kind of systemic stress, and what's needed to address one issue is going to probably be different from what's needed for another issue. And so that's also really challenging for investors to get their heads around. And, you know, where TIIP has probably been at it the longest and has done the most comprehensive work on it. And, you know, even we acknowledge fully that there are still gray spaces on the map that have to be colored in if the investment community is truly going to integrate this and transform.
Yep. Okay.
That was probably more of a response that you were looking for, but that's like, you know.
No, it's fine because you're giving the color and depth that we need. It isn't, there are examples, but also the general thrust of what's really going on, which people need to know, because one can be rather isolated in not knowing. And the fact we're learning from you and others in the series about what's happening and how it all works through interconnectedness of all of these efforts to change. On that point, I just want to mention to everybody watching, if you would like to ask a question about impact investment or issues directly related or slightly indirectly related to what we're discussing, please write the question. I see Ali's put one in already, but put the question in the side in the chat, and we'll pick them up in a little while. That would be super. And because and if we like the question, we'll invite you on to actually ask the question and perhaps follow up. So that would be great if you could join in this discussion. Something I'd like to ask, there are a number of elements in reading your book, again, to prove I read it, something I found fascinating is you brought up the example of Newark and New Jersey. As someone who's interested in urban planning and in this new world of climate change, we're going to have to really rethink how we design cities, making them easier to live in and on a multiple levels. I thought it was a very interesting example of the role of, say, the Prudential that I've met historically when I worked in London, in New York, went to see them. Could this exercise of what happened in New York be replicated easily in other cities, not just in America and perhaps Europe, but in developing economies?
Yeah, so I think you hone in on exactly it, right? So what we would often describe what Prudential did in New Jersey in particular was to essentially take this diversity of approaches. And that diversity of approaches was both meant to address issues around social justice and systemic racism that was prompted by this kind of summer of distress and rioting in the US. But that it also was kind of looking at the dynamics that were ultimately responsible. Like, what were the fundamentals that were otherwise generally hampering development and progress within this particular area of Jersey? And really trying to understand, based on, okay, there's an issue that we know is systemic in nature. We see this kind of local system that we want to try to address. And so what they were doing was essentially looking at multiple layers or multiple entrance points to start to intervene to address that issue. CDPQ in Canada has done something similar. And so there's a number of investors that are really taking these place-based strategies and trying to understand both, you see this in investments in things like evergreen cooperatives, where, there's a mandate attached to those investments to using like anchor institutions like hospitals and universities to essentially build out businesses that are owned by people in the community, and that these big institutions that are not going anywhere because they are inherently part of the tapestry of these communities, that they can actually start to employ people, that they can start to create avenues of opportunity in a way that they never considered before. And you see that kind of spirit or that kind of thinking starting to manifest with a lot of, particularly in the impact investment crowd, where they're looking at these place-based strategies and trying to understand, how do we enable economic development and in a way that addresses things like housing, like health, like opportunities, and really taking this kind of multifaceted lens on addressing these issues. Because yet again, as any investor on this knows that has engaged in sustainable or impact investing, that oftentimes you can run into a situation like unintended consequences. And so it's trying to understand, how is what we're doing, particularly in this place-based context, how are we doing to make sure that we are additive so that we're not redundant, and how do we make sure that we are starting to create more durability and resilience within these small ecosystems, And so that's what we're seeing a lot more of. It's still, you see these experiments where a number of investors have come together, like say in Detroit, Michigan. That was a big thing, and it was kind of anchored by the efforts of Kresge. Or you see a lot of the work that MacArthur's been leading, and others. And so I think that there's more and more you're starting to see pockets of that, or guys in St. Thomas Foundation in the UK that's really looked at trying to address childhood obesity and the kind of determinants of health within particular ages. So they really focus on children and youth. They focus on the issue of childhood obesity, and they really try to understand how does that dynamic then ultimately hamper the health of an overarching community. And so a number of these investors are attempting to grapple with it. But inherent in a lot of these, and I think this is one of the issues that often comes up is, okay, people want, okay, what does that progress look like? And when you're driving systemic change, it's just the horizon on being able to really show the results and show how these outcomes were affected and fundamentally reshaped. It just takes a longer horizon than even sometimes impact and sustainable investors are comfortable with. And so I think that that's part of also like the resetting of expectations as people take the system lens that kind of has to come through.
Great. Thank you for that. If you, by the way, again, asking questions, you can also use the Zoom to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I hope, by the way, Bill, your battery life on your phone can last the conversation, and it is fine.
Me too.
Ali, I'd like to bring in Ali Arni to ask his question. If you can bring it in.
Okay. Hi, Bill. First, I want to thank you for joining our webinar series. Now, when we talk about systemic change or change at the system level, this implies it's a cross-cutting effort. Now, when a cross-cutting effort, this means that you have to work horizontally and you cannot work on a certain specific vertical. So that requires orchestrating many efforts from usually different players. So my question is, who is suitable to do this orchestrating? Is it the government? Is it the business resource organizations? Or is it the community associations? My guess also that this type of thing, which is really what makes systemic change much harder, is the orchestrating that is needed to be done. Thank you.
Yeah, no. So it's great. I mean, it's funny. In the community economic development world, there's this really interesting body of work that was led by David Erickson out of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And he really honed in on this idea of a community quarterback. And so he was looking at community economic development within primarily cities or rural areas, so a little bit more self-contained, and kind of understanding what would be needed if you were to try to mobilize the constellation of nonprofits, government actors, and private sector enterprise and investors to really drive change like this. And I think ultimately what we're finding is that depending on the system in question and depending on the kind of goal of the investor, oftentimes what happens is you have an investor that essentially takes the lead. Look at Climate Action 100 Plus, this kind of global consortium of big investors that are attempting to identify and target with intervention the kind of biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, publicly held corporations of greenhouse gases, as in a way to use their collective clout and influence to really drive fundamental change at these companies, with the idea that if we can get these biggest emitters of greenhouse gases to not emit so much, that will make a kind of disproportionate impact on climate change more broadly. And that really took, it was like essentially 3 investors that really were the impetus for that, and then they brought along others. And so when you think about it, using that as kind of this jump off point, is to say, yes, it often will take an investor. Oftentimes it takes a bigger institutional investor that has the kind of heft to really draw in others and influence others. And that can ultimately serve as a mechanism where it's not necessarily them that has to do all of the change and take on all the responsibility for it, but it does mean that it helps kind of incentivize other big players and even smaller players. So oftentimes in the foundation community, you'll have the $50 million foundations that don't necessarily have the bandwidth or resources to build out a staff to do the kinds of things we're talking about, but they can follow along through various consortiums and types of coalitions. They can follow along with other investors to really amplify their voice and really drive change. So oftentimes it does take an investor that is kind of leading by doing. So they've done the work to integrate, enhance, or otherwise develop policies, programs, and products that kind of integrate a system level focus. But that the goal is to try to very quickly go into influencing the behavior of other investors to drive them towards that common interest. So it takes a lot. And along the way, one of the system level strategies that they're ultimately going to be pursuing is how to influence policy so that policy catches up. So it's this thing of, it often does take the investor that can do it. But I would say, we can also point to groups like Domini Impact Investments that, right when the pandemic hit around something like labor and workers' rights, they were one of the first ones putting together a letter to essentially engage the investment community and corporates around making sure that workers were protected. That was huge. And it's the kind of thing that those kinds of efforts, it's a little bit easier in the engagement space, but those kinds of efforts are, it does take an investor kind of taking the lead on it, but ultimately with that goal of very quickly influencing other investors or policymakers.
I have to say, thanks for that, Bill. Having worked in the city and finance for a long time, I do think that we're going to, given the trends we're seeing, I still think that the governments, regulators, and the markets are going to have to take, I think, a greater role in really pushing forward this agenda and program of change. But we'll see. I'd like to bring in Vinit Sharma. I see, by the way, other questions, and we'll come to you, Carrie, Ali, and Charlotte. But can we bring in Vinit Sharma to ask us a question? You'll need to unmute, though, Vinit, obviously.
Yes, it was a brilliant discussion by you, William. So my basic question was that, regarding there's lack of, standardization and transparency as far as these, ESG ratings are concerned. We don't have that sort of, what you call, that sort of, transparency where one can, judge where there are various contradictions, within firms itself, and between investors, insurance firms, financiers, etc. So how can we basically bring synergy into it? For example, a firm that is manufacturing, for example, say lithium, or for that matter, is basically sourcing them, is basically going to be, badly regarded by the rating agency because they are into, what you call environmentally unsustainable product. But for the, say EV manufacturing, car manufacturing, like Tesla, the ratings will be high simply because, they are basically using its end product. So how can we, bring some kind of, what you call, homogeneity, so that, that the rating agencies can, be better, there can be better transparency regarding it. For example, utility that is producing, electricity for these, what you call, these, EV, batteries and all that, basically is going to be regarded badly, because it is using, these diesel and petrol, sourcing petrol and diesel. But the batteries are running, because the automobiles are running, on the electric vehicles, so they will be, rated much more, in a lot more, in a sustainable way. So how can we bring that kind of transparency, so that the entire, the industry can be, can be betterly, graded, So yeah.
Vinit, thank you. So there are quite a few very interesting points: transparency and standardization of ESG and ratings. So, Bill, what can you respond to that?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I think so. Yet again, I would go back to all right. So my business partner talks about how he's been in the industry for a long time. He helped co-found Domini. He is the L of KLD. He established the first ESG index. He has this like very long arc in this, and he talks about how when he was just starting out in this industry, that when they wanted to get the kind of ESG profile of a corporation, it was back in the day where it meant like cutting out newspaper clippings with like scissors, and it meant sending notes to companies to request annual reports that they could then get sent physically to them, and blah, blah, blah. Now you can see a lot of this data like on a Bloomberg terminal. And so I think it just, I make that point because I want us to just keep in mind that the pace of change and what's happening now in the industry, both on a voluntary standards level, but also on a mandatory standards level, is really accelerating in comparison to where it's been, is accelerating actually quite quickly. And our understanding of what needs to be disclosed and what is kind of more window dressing, that's also increasing in our understanding. And I think I can point to a couple of different things that I view as steps in the right direction. By no means perfect, but progress is progress. And so you think about something like on the voluntary standards side, take an issue like SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board here in the US, really taking the lead on mapping the materiality, the ESG materiality characteristics of essentially all of the industries that compose the US economy. And that has recently merged with, I'm now blanking on the group that it merged with, but somebody, I'm sure Ali or someone else will remind me, but that they've merged. And so with a global body, so now it's like the Integrated Value Foundation, something like that. Somebody on this webinar is going to correct me on the names, but that's a huge moment of an opportunity to really standardize, obviously voluntary standards, but standardize how we think about materiality and how that ultimately gets integrated into how companies think about the value of these characteristics, but also how investors then can make decisions based on that. That's huge. At the same time, for the first time ever, take CFA Institute. They incubated an ESG certification in the UK. It's now actually being adopted by CFA Institute more globally. So now we're actually going, as part of the CFA credentialing, you can actually now get a certificate in ESG. That's huge. And I think the movement by specific jurisdictions to really clarify or otherwise change laws on the books to, the rules of the game, to really start to understand this, embrace it, and incentivize it, that's all starting to catch up too. I mean, the European standard and definition of impact investment was a huge development. And it's, and the whole need for impact verification and things like that. These are all these like very big steps in the right direction. And I think we're going to continue to see more of this general alignment as well as standardization occur. I think government is, like I said, practice is leading theory. It's also leading policy. And so I think that we're going to continue to see more innovation happening, perhaps quicker than policy catches up to. But I do think that what's happening with the SEC here, what's happening in various European jurisdictions, I think are all big signs of progress. And even in Japan, we've done a lot of work in Japan just to see how much that jurisdiction's changed in terms of its thinking around sustainable investing. Still not there, still lots of ways to go, but I do think that these are important points of progress. And when you consider it yet again from the arc of where we were, cutting out newspaper clippings and trying to make assessments on ESG characteristics based on that, to now being able to hop on the Bloomberg terminal and other sorts of standards and developments that have occurred, I think we can point to a lot of this progress. The one thing I would say, and this is just a general caution for a lot of folks that are very eager to get this kind of harmonization, standardization, all of that, is that take something like materiality standards. And one of the things that we will often say, we think this is great. It's a huge step in the right direction for the industry. We can actually really start to connect the actual value that's being generated for long-term performance. These are big things. But the one thing that we would caution is that what's material today may not be material tomorrow. And that's really important to remember when you're thinking about systems dynamics and the need to kind of understand and embrace that. I always go back to this idea of durability, that these systems, they're constantly changing. They're very dynamic. And so, as we set these standards, we just have to be mindful that we're creating an enabling environment that allows us to be adaptable, to kind of adjust and whatnot, but that we're not creating so much of an enabling environment that we almost like restrict and constrain what's possible, because these issues, we were all generally unprepared for a global pandemic on the level that we've been experiencing. And you can point to some of these other big developments of uncertainty that investors are still struggling to figure out how to navigate through. And that uncertainty, we have to allow for that and understand that, and just make sure that we are as effective as possible in terms of addressing it.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, and we're going to have to rattle through a few more questions. And I have two issues I still want to touch on before we finish. But Carrie, would you want to ask your question directly? Can you put your hand up? Otherwise, I'll ask it. Would you like to ask it yourself? Yeah. Can we bring in Carrie then? I think if she's still there. Otherwise, I'll ask it.
Hi.
Oh, there you
Hi,
are.
Bill. Nice to see you.
Very nice to see you.
Thanks for this discussion. And my question was around how do we need to adapt the specific tools of finance for the systemic outcomes that we are trying to achieve? We've seen a lot of work happen in the accounting field, SASB being, and this recent merger being a great example, but I'm concerned that we haven't paid enough attention to how we need to innovate and adapt the actual metrics and measurement and application of finance for these kinds of different outcomes that we're seeking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so there's a lot in that question. It's a great question. One of the things that this is kind of by way of illustration of what we mean when we talk about needing to enhance a lot of these standard steps that investors take. And it gets to your point about, okay, yes, we fully acknowledge that there are other kinds of techniques that are going to need to be brought into the fold that are not the traditional purview of investors, or they don't typically act that way. So we highlight a number of field building techniques, and we talk about kind of different investment enhancement techniques, things like that just are not the typical purview. But for the ones the specific things that investors, it's kind of the bread and butter of investing today. And this goes back to, investment belief and policy statements, portfolio construction, security selection, corporate engagement, manager selection, so on and so forth. We go a lot into, particularly in the book, but our work more generally, we go a lot into how do these things need to evolve. And so let's just go with a specific step around allocating assets. The thing there is that it's incumbent upon investors to start to consider that kind of functional utility of their asset classes as it relates to the system they're ultimately trying to influence. And so this goes into this rift that we often talk about where it's like so every system will have different kinds of stresses. And so we talk about climate change. The issue with climate change is that we have an entire kind of global energy sector that's largely based on fossil fuels, that we're not adaptable enough as these different shocks occur. In an issue like income inequality, that there's essentially this lack of connectivity all the way from shareholders down to the lowest paid employee. And you see that. You see these kind of different indicators of systemic health or lack of health, and it varies. So when you start to think about applying that kind of thinking, but then applying to something like asset allocation, you start to consider the complexity, the interconnected quality, whatever, of the particular issue. And so we'll say stuff like, if you're taking public market activity and you're thinking about, okay, I want to align or integrate this kind of focus within public equities or fixed income securities, what you're really driving at is more kind of what we call evolutionary change. The change will ultimately be very big because you're influencing big super tankers, but it's going to happen over a long period of time. Now, if you're looking for more disruptive change, because the system under stress in particular is disruptive, or that we see so much uncertainty related to it, or we just generally see opportunity and accelerated progress, then you might focus more on venture capital, private equity, things that they reach more revolutionary or disruptive change. And so it's really starting to think about stuff. And for each conventional step that an investor takes, or that, an investor that is integrating ESG or whatever they take, it's starting to add that additional layer of nuance on these very traditional things and choices that they're making. So that's what we mean by that. And it requires like a different level of altitude in some cases to kind of understand the underlying dynamics, but that's the kind of stuff we mean. So hopefully, I don't know if that gets, I feel like I've answered part of your question. Good.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. I think given time, can we try and again keep it a little bit short? Sherwat, do you want to ask your question, or will I ask it for you? If you want to put up, if you're still on, put up your hand. Can you do that? Sherwat, there we are. Can Sherwat ask the question, please? Thank you. Sherwat, the sound. Sherwat, muting. Hold on, let me just see.
There
we
go.
are. Yeah.
All right. No, again, fascinating discussion. And you know, my question had been responded somewhat in answer to Carrie's question. So the thing is, we face on the, you know, when you measure risk or you want to assess risk, there's always that, you know, unknown and adaptive way where things are going to hit you no matter what. But you can plan for change. So are we really trying to, and I didn't get a chance to read your book, but Bill, my question to Bill would be, can you plan, so, you know, the systemic change without fully assuring and covering all the systemic risks that you brought up in the earlier part of your discussion? Is that a part of the piece we have to make with?
Yeah, so that's why it goes back to, and I definitely want to make sure this point gets hammered hard. That's why to drive systemic change, it is not the job or the possibility of one investor, right? So that goal of uniting with other investors and really trying to drive behavior and action, not just within your own institution, but with those of others, that's the only way, even in a specific issue, that you're going to be able to drive any sort of fundamental progress. But it's also the way that you begin to start to acknowledge that complexity and that interconnection across other issues, because that collaborative collective action question or opportunity, it's such the antithesis of the financial community. You know this. I mean, anybody that's been invested, that this is not a collaborative thing by nature, right? Like, we're all looking for our competitive edge and whatnot. So that in and of itself is such a different step for the investment community, but it goes back to the only way we will drive fundamental change within a particular issue or drive it in a way that's controlling for the uncertainty of other issues and other dynamics is if we're moving collectively. So that's where it gets to. It's like, it's a different kind of opportunity and challenge for the investment community than they've been used to. But that's the best, you know, it's the best way that we can kind of describe it.
All right. All right. It's the whole thing. It's not just the it's not the attitude towards it. It's the, you know, people really understanding that when you're investing, you want to know how much you're putting in and how much you're taking out of it. And that's the catch that I think will always be haunting this approach. But thank you. No, I'm going to.
Well, it absolutely speaks to this problem of incentives, right? I mean, people are not incentivized to operate in that way as it's currently constructed, right? Like, as the financial industry is currently constructed. This is part of that big challenge that we as an industry have to really get to terms with, not just for system level investment, but also for, you know, just basic sustainable and impact investing, right?
Sure. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
It's
lovely to see you, and I have to say I look forward to seeing you on campus. But thank you for the question. The first question, but actually the last one to be asked, Ali Rashid. Ali, shall I ask your question, or do you want to put your hand up and you can ask it yourself if you're still there? He's not put it up, so maybe is that? Oh, there we are. Ali, do you want to ask your question? Again, muting. Let's just see if we can unmute you. There we are. So Ali, can you speak up, Ali?
Yes. Is it okay right now?
No, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. First of all, for this great session, and for the organizers, Dr. Ali Aouni, Gerard Center, and you, Claire. Thank you so much for granting me this chance to actually ask my question. First of all, actually, my question may be a little bit away from the topic of it's about actually the digital currency and the digital economy, and how this affects the investing actually environment, and especially what is the situation for the small investors and so on. So this is actually my question. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. So I think you're fundamentally asking like, how does something like cryptocurrency fit into all this? Is that
yes?
Assuming
I
that?
think given his question, yes, I think so.
Yeah. So I think so I would say we have intentionally not expressed a house view yet on crypto. And so I'm going to kind of punt on this question a little bit. But I will say that I think until, I mean, you saw that the kind of development that just happened. I think it was in Latin America where they switched to, I think, some form of crypto as like a baseline currency that the government's backing, and there was a big dip in the market, and it was an interesting issue. I think that crypto generally, and what the ESG crowd I think has pointed to, is that there's real possibility from a transparency perspective because of the digital ledger and all of that. So when we start to think about impact and the level of transparency that we could start to enable by virtue of crypto, I think that there's definitely some possibilities there. I think for us in particular, it's the verdict, despite there being a lot of buzz and excitement about it, I think the verdict is still a little bit out in terms of how much institutional investors are going to embrace it. And I think that there's also just this general acknowledgement that there is some real environmental cost towards crypto. And so there's a lot of these kind of known unknowns that still need time to, I think, fully sort themselves out. But like with anything, these innovations they're promising for a reason, and it's an area that we continue to watch very closely. I'm largely punting on the answer to that question for very particular reasons.
Okay, thank you for that. Like, two final issues I want to bring up. I'd love to bring up. One is the issue which has perplexed me this year, and also I think it highlights one of the weaknesses in what would the movement of trying to have more impactful investment and trying to fulfill ESG objectives. And it's the example and case study of Danone, where a number of hedge funds stepped up to say that to Danone that even though Danone was doing more than its competitors to meet these new targets and so on and cut pollution and plastic, that they, because there was a slight hit on earnings, they were able to push out the chair and CEO. Do you have anything to say about that, about the lack of unity or large investors not being able or not fighting back to say we're backing Danone?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting lightning rod, right? And I think it speaks to this larger problem with modern portfolio theory generally, but also kind of neoclassical liberalism. I mean, it's the underpinnings of how we all think and operate, and ultimately what one of the big kind of contributions it's made is shareholder primacy. And I think we have often focused on this in the context of income inequality and the kinds of systemic consequences of shareholder primacy. And I think that what the issue with Danone is, it's illustrative of that tension. It's to say, do these things, but only do these things if it's inflating stock value in the short term. And I think until we ultimately are able to change the culture of the financial industry and really start to demonstrate the need for and the incentives for prioritizing long-term performance and prioritizing more stakeholder value, I think that we're going to continue to see instances like this. And it's unfortunate because I think in most cases, people would have looked at that company and been like, this is a company that's geared towards, industries of the future, that sort of thing. And so it's unfortunate when you see something like that happen. And I think like with anything it was like when Volkswagen had the big scandal stuff around emissions. And it was like, all of the big ESG data providers had to rewrite their assessments of Volkswagen as a result and whatnot. And I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to have instances of like this. We're going to have where it's either just investors acting in a way that is counter to a lot of this more long-term systemic focus that we want them to have, or that ultimately puts stains on unwarranted or unnecessarily put stains on the entire movement. Think about a barrage when that essentially had its big issues. These things end up kind of staining the market in a way where it's like, yeah, but in the conventional investment world that is completely agnostic of ESG or sustainability, there are plenty of scandals, there are plenty of blowups, there are plenty of these things. And so what ends up happening is oftentimes these instances, they become the rule, they become the big thing. And so I would just caution people to not necessarily draw too many conclusions out of it. But it is to say that, yeah, it's a, as you move in this direction, and it's one of the points that we make in the book, that you're not throwing out the fundamentals of investing. And we have this chart in the book where we talk about conventional investing, and that built on top of that is sustainable investing, and then built on top of that is a system level lens. And the big point that we're trying to make is to say, as you move in this direction, you're not throwing out the fundamentals, you're essentially just enhancing them. And I think it's a lesson for any leadership of these companies like Danone and others, where you still have to necessarily control it, where it's still in that kind of transition phase where you still have to control for a lot of the more short-term shareholder primacy type considerations while you're attempting to build out these long-term strategies. It's a really tricky dance that you have to do on 2 feet. And I think it will be that way for a fair amount of longer, but for those that get it right, they're going to be ahead of the market. And the market is, like I said at the top of this, it is starting to catch on in a much faster way.
Thank goodness. There was a question from Carrie that she was asking, what about the long-term stock exchange? I assume the role of the stock exchange longer term, what hope does it offer for encouraging others, I assume, to take a longer term view? That's quite a complex issue. As somebody who's been an investment banker a long time, I'm not altogether sure, but this is your forum. Bill, what would you say to that?
Wait, so say the question one more time.
The question is, what about the long-term stock? She asked, actually, Carrie, are you there? Do you want to ask it? Maybe easier if you want to come back on. Can you do that?
Yeah.
Okay. You want to ask the question? Unmute. There we are. Okay.
Sorry, it wasn't letting me act. Anyway, I don't mean to extend the conversation, but it's just it's almost more of a suggestion than anything for this particular conversation. But there is an actual long-term stock exchange, as Bill, I know you know, that has just been launched. And as we talk about this, the longer-term view, the cultural change that needs to happen in the capital markets more broadly, what role might that particular institution be playing or help us play in that cultural transformation? But I'm also respectful that we're well beyond time now. So
I'll respond really quickly to say thank you for raising it. It's an important contribution, and I think it goes back to this idea that if we're going to, much in the same way that as any individual investor, when they think about driving system change, they, in an issue like income inequality or climate change, or pick the issue, that they have to use, oftentimes we talk about one of the big techniques is the diversity of approaches. It's going to take all these different intervention points to ultimately drive change. Reforming the financial system is no different than any other system. And so we have got to start to demonstrate that the things that the investment community relies on, stock exchanges, indexes, things like that, that help essentially move money, that those same utilities or the same scaffolding, as it were, of these kinds of buildings, those have to be present. And so I think we come down on it's a huge important contribution, and because long-termism is inherently a fundamental characteristic of taking a system level perspective. So anything that gets investors to consider the issues through that lens, or consider the decisions through that lens, is a net win. And so we welcome it, we applaud it, and definitely appreciate you putting that on the radar of folks on this call.
So yeah, thanks, Carrie, for the final question. There, just two very quickly before we wrap up, Bill. I just saw this tweet from the World Bank in the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, from Farid Belhaj, who said that the World Bank has set an ambitious new target of 35% of the World Bank's financing to go towards climate-related projects and investments on average over the next 5 years. And they're saying they're looking ahead to COP26 in Glasgow, if it's not delayed, of course, and in Egypt next year. rather interesting. And I just want to say, I'm not going to have time to ask my question, which is related to elements in your book, but also general issues about income inequality here, which I think is a very significant issue. I think at some stage, Bill, I'd love to have another talk to you about that, but very much. But on the note, I'm going to have to say thank you very much indeed. First of all, for the joy of reading your book, which I recommend others to read who are interested, and for your contribution today by your mobile phone. I'm very glad it lasted through today, but thank you very much. It's been superb. I look forward to continuing the conversation, whether it's through this or in another venue, very much. I want to thank Professor Ali Aouni and the team at the Burckart Center for this tremendous series of program. It's just been great. Dina, I'm sorry that, oh, you're just applauding, thank you. That for Ali, just a tremendous program. And I thank him personally and professionally for this, just superb for Professor Aouni. I just want to make a reminder for everyone, if you don't know, next week on September the 15th, oh, let me just one sec, I've lost my view there, hold on a second. On September the 15th, at 7 o'clock Cairo time, there's a webinar on achieving a zero emissions global economy through a global Green New Deal. Robert Pollin is the distinguished university professor of economics and director of the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So next Wednesday, the 15th. So again, Bill, thank you. And to everyone attending today, thank you very, very much indeed. And goodbye to all of you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.